Hi everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Non-GMO Project Forms and Documents. This will guide you through a theoretical case study on how you, as an applicant, would begin the process. My name is Jessica Green, and shortly I will introduce my co-presenter for this webinar. A few points before we get started. As you may have noticed, the webinar has been started in mute mode to minimize disruptions. If you have questions, please use the chat feature at the bottom left side of the screen. Please make use of this chat room feature during the presentation. We will address the questions in the Q&A section. This time is for you, and all names will be kept anonymous. A copy of the presentation will be emailed to all attendees that provided their email and contact information during the start of the webinar, but feel free to email the addresses listed on this slide following the call. As I said earlier, my name is Jessica Green, and I am a reviewer for NSF's Consumer Values Verified division. And I've been with NSF for 7.5 years, and I've had years of in-depth technical experience with the Non-GMO project, as well as some of our other projects and programs here in Consumer Values Verified. Today I'm joined by my co-presenter, Caitlin Millender, who is also a technical reviewer for the NSF Consumer Values Verified team. Caitlin, would you like to say hi to the group?
Hi everyone, thanks for the introduction. Yes, I've worked with NSF for 2 years now, and I've been mostly dedicated to Non-GMO projects. I've worked as a certification project manager, working directly with companies like yours, and now I've moved into a reviewer role, and I am happy to be presenting with Jessica today. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. That was awesome. This webinar is part 2 of 2, the Non-GMO Project Forms and Documents. We also offer and recommend part 1, which is called Non-GMO Project Pronto, Standard and Overview. For those of us short on time, this webinar provides a high-level overview of the NSF Consumer Values Verified Non-GMO Project Portfolio. We really get more into the technical details of the Non-GMO project, how to leverage your existing NSF certification to help achieve NGP verification, as well as tips for success. If you haven't already signed up for the additional webinars, please visit our website. Along with the Non-GMO project series, we also cover other certification programs like gluten-free and True Source Honey certification that can also be bundled with your Non-GMO project verification. Many of you know NSF because of SQF, BRC, or other food safety certifications. We are a business unit that currently offers Non-GMO project verification, gluten-free certifications, raised without antibiotics, and True Source certifications. It is important to note that NSF is independent from the Non-GMO project. We are a third-party technical administrator for the Non-GMO project. So what that means is that we interpret the standard and apply the rules to ensure products meet their requirements. NSF is committed to the professional, efficient, and independent certification activities and leaves the advocacy work to the advocates. In this webinar, we will start off with a refresher of the Non-GMO requirements. But again, for full details, please join us for the Non-GMO Project Pronto webinar, which covers the standard and general information on GMOs. But today we will then go into some detail in the verification process here at NSF. We will take you through the verification process for our theoretical product, Mama Marcy's Primavera Marinara. All formulas and suppliers are made up, but the process is real. We will begin with our application forms and how to fill them out, then how to classify your ingredients according to the NGP standard. And we will get into the specific documents needed to demonstrate compliance, including specific compliance affidavits and some details about sampling and testing. So we'll start with an overview of the Non-GMO project. There are 4 main pillars to the Non-GMO project: compliant inputs, segregation and cleanout, traceability, and testing for high-risk inputs. The Non-GMO project is very much a process-based standard. However, only individual products can carry the claim. The standard looks at the product level compliance through compliant inputs, and these compliant products must come out of a compliant quality management system with principles and protocols of traceability, segregation, and cleanout to avoid GM contamination and commingling. In this program, you cannot certify an entire production site and all the products made there, as you might think from other food safety standards. For the Non-GMO project, each product must be assessed from each facility. Traceability and segregation are the 2 main requirements of a compliant quality management system. Each lot of the Non-GMO project verified product or input must be traceable back to the specific lots of that input used in its production. Systematic procedures shall be in place for tracking of lot numbers and or making the labeling and packaging containers and storage facilities to assure that traceability of inputs, work in progress, and final products at all points in the production process. If your operation is dedicated strictly to Non-GMO project standard compliant production, then it is sufficient to have a record-keeping system that records the lot numbers for all inputs used to make a specific lot of product. Traceability records should explicitly trace and track the Non-GMO project standard compliance status inputs. We will request documentations of this during the application process. Examples of these documents will be requested with the document compliance plan submitted as part of the application process. Participants should also anticipate for these documentations to be requested during the on-site inspection if an on-site inspection is required. The aim of a cleanout and segregation procedure is to prevent GMO contamination of inputs, work in process, and final products. Receiving, production, processing, manufacturing, transfer, and storage facilities, as well as shipping and transportation conveniences, which should be inspected and purged as needed to remove sources of GMO contamination. All relevant cleaning, purging, and inspection shall be documented. These standard sanitation operating procedures, employee training logs, checklists, etc., should be supplied with the compliance plan as well, so that you can demonstrate compliance to this requirement of the Non-GMO project standard. So as you mentioned, traceability and segregation are the 2 main requirements of a compliant quality management system. The other 2 components of the Non-GMO project standard are compliant inputs and testing for high-risk inputs. We'll go further into detail on how to classify inputs and testing requirements later.
So while all of these components are necessary to substantiate the compliance of your products, let's be honest, they can be a little intimidating, not to mention they can take some time. Let's now take a look at the verification process here at NSF and the steps in place to help you navigate through demonstrating compliance for your products. The non-GMO verification process at NSF is a 6-step process: application, pre-assessment review and report, on-site inspection, desk audit, NC resolution, and the verification decision and ongoing compliance. In the initial application step, you'll supply detailed information about your facility and the products you are submitting for verification review. This includes product formulas, ingredient lists, and the documentation needed to demonstrate compliance for the inputs used in the manufacturing of your products that are seeking verification. We will also request information on the production facility. This includes your non-GMO compliance plan demonstrating the protocols and practices in place at the facility for traceability, segregation, and cleanup. We will ask for a flow chart describing the steps in the manufacturing process, including equipment names that can be linked to the sanitation procedures you have in place at the facility. At this point in the process, NSF staff will prepare your documents and files for pre-assessment review. Again, we will get into more detail on the type of documents that will be submitted to demonstrate compliance. Once this initial documentation is submitted, your documentation will be evaluated by a technical reviewer. Step 2 is pre-assessment review and report. At this point, an NSF evaluator will review your submitted information and prepare a pre-assessment report. The pre-assessment report will be a detailed evaluation of the documents initially submitted and sort of a to-do list of any outstanding required documents and clarifications still needed to demonstrate compliance for the product seeking verification or in regards to the manufacturing facility. At this point, you will be assigned a certification project manager, or CPM as we like to call it, to help guide you through the remainder of the verification process here at NSF. Your CPM will work closely with you on this step to provide guidance and ensure compliance to the non-GMO project standards. Once you review those findings and make the necessary corrections and additions, we will submit your responses to the pre-assessment report and move on to the inspection stage or desk audit. And now, step 3. Unless the producing facility is exempted from inspection, all facilities are required to be inspected. You may not have to undergo an on-site inspection if you are producing products in which there are only low-risk inputs, if your products that are using low or high-risk inputs all qualify for micro-exemption and or approval based on supplier affidavit, if your products are being produced in a facility with no parallel processing of high-risk inputs, if your facility is dedicated to organic production and there is no parallel processing of high-risk ingredients, and lastly, if you are a contract processor that complies with the requirements of the standard. However, if you are manufacturing products where parallel processing occurs, and parallel processing occurs when your products seeking verification have a high-risk input at 5% or more, and you also have compliant and non-compliant versions of that very same input handled at the manufacturing facility in products seeking verification or not. So if parallel processing occurs at the facility, an inspection will be required. Please note that if the high-risk input is already non-GMO project verified, for the purposes of determining inspection, the input is classified as low risk. The operation will be assessed to confirm consistency with the documentation you submitted on how you intend to comply with the non-GMO project standards. We are inspecting you to confirm that the policies and procedures you documented on paper during the application and pre-assessment phases are truly what you are doing in practice. The inspector will conduct a mass balance exercise and trace-back exercise, will also verify the efficacy of the compliance plan, the segregation and trace-back systems, and that all necessary record-keeping requirements are in place. The inspector may comment on critical control points and how commingling and contamination may be prevented at these points. If the inspector has any non-GMO project integrity concerns, they may be highlighted in the inspection report, and it is NSF's responsibility to issue any corrective action and determine compliance. Any discrepancies between what is recorded in the compliance paperwork compared to what was observed on site may result in corrective actions. This leads us to step 4. Step 4 is the desk audit. After we have received your complete reply to the pre-assessment report and the inspection report, if required, we proceed to the desk audit. If no inspection is required, your complete reply to the pre-assessment report will move directly to desk audit. Let's discuss what the desk audit entails. An NSF evaluator will review your replies to the pre-assessment report, identify the additional clarification or corrections made to your program in response to the pre-assessment report, and any findings from the inspection. Any additional items that are still needed will be compiled in a corrective action letter and you will have 30 days to reply to any major nonconformities and 90 days for any minor issues. Step 5 is noncompliance resolution, if necessary. If noncompliances were found in the desk audit, you will receive a list of these points. Your certification project manager will work with you on gathering acceptable corrective actions and documentation needed to mitigate the noncompliances. Once these observed noncompliances are corrected, the verification decision will be made. This is the 6th and final step, verification and ongoing compliance. Once you've successfully completed the process, you are verified to the Non-GMO project standard. You have the option to incorporate the Non-GMO project verified seal on your packaging in accordance with the licensing agreement in place with the Non-GMO project. Final packaging with the Non-GMO verification seal must be submitted to NSF for review and approval. We will evaluate any romance language and claims used on the packaging to confirm all claims regarding the GM content are true and accurate. Keep in mind any claims declaring absolute absence of GMOs are not acceptable if using the non-GMO seal. While the intent of the non-GMO project is that no GM DNA is present, this verification process does not confirm the absence of all GM DNA. Claims such as GMO-free or GE-free are not acceptable. However, non-GMO claims are accepted. And process-based claims such as made with non-GMO ingredients must be evaluated by NSF to confirm they are in line with the terms of the licensing agreement you have in place with the non-GMO project. It is your responsibility to ensure all trademark guidelines, including placement, shading, and coloring, are in compliance with the licensing agreement in place with the non-GMO project for the use and affixing of the verification seal. The current licensing agreement is for the U.S. and Canada markets only. If you are marketing your products in other countries, you will need to contact the non-GMO project directly. Now Jessica will walk us through how to fill out the forms properly.
So now you're ready to go on to non-GMO project verification. You've contacted our Business Development Manager, Marcy Burton, at mburton@nsf.org and contracted with NSF as your technical administration for the verification process. And now it's time to receive the proper application packet and the accompanying forms. As you and I know, there are many ways an operation may be structured, and therefore there are multiple application types for the non-GMO project program based on the type of business you have. The first is a brand owner. A brand owner is the owner of a brand that markets products under a certain name or umbrella and may or may not produce products themselves. In other words, a brand owner may own or directly manage several processing facilities, and they may produce all or some of the products under the brand owner's name at each of these facilities. If the brand owner does not directly manage a manufacturing facility, they will apply as a brand owner and provide information on each co-packer or contract manufacturer producing the product seeking verification. There are certain minimum requirements for the co-packers. This includes 1, having a system designed to avoid GMOs and having that system reviewed by the technical administrator. 2, all inputs must comply with the non-GMO project standard, including genetic testing for high-risk inputs when applicable. There is a 3-year exemption from inspections at co-packing facilities. Unless otherwise exempt from inspection, during this time the TA, like NSF, will determine if an inspection is required. After 3 years, the participant must either adopt a plan for the co-packer to become a full participant or sponsor a facility survey and on-site inspection. A co-packer can also apply as a participant. A co-packer 1 may be contracted by a brand owner to develop a formulation, create, and process a product on behalf of that brand owner. 2, they independently invest in a robust quality management system and market themselves as being able to provide this service to brand owners or even other co-manufacturers. Or 3, a brand owner can come to a co-packer with an established formulation and suppliers, and the co-manufacturer is simply responsible for producing the product. In this case, and in the case where brand owners produce the products themselves, they would be classified by NSF as a handler and would receive the handler application packet and supply information directly to NSF on the manufacturing process in place at each facility manufacturing product seeking certification. If you are a grower and producing the product seeking verification, you too fall in the handler option as you are handling and manufacturing the products, and information will be needed if any post-harvesting activities are performed. Livestock and animal feed is another important category. While the non-GMO project compliance is virtually the same as any handler, the feed ration for each animal or group management system must be provided to fully assess the products for compliance, whether the animal product or the feed mill itself is seeking verification. In all of these cases, or even in other situations, NSF will work with you to understand your business model, the compliance type you're looking to achieve, the extent of the direct or indirect involvement you intend to have, any confidentiality concerns, and who will be physically and or legally responsible for the compliant product. So we use the initial application to determine the operation type and the number of products seeking verification. NSF counts each unique formula as one product, and the NGP count will count each unique product listing as one product. So if you are manufacturing one formula for two brands, NSF counts this as one formula review and two products that will ultimately be listed on the NGP website. The participant that applies for the verification and pays the fees is considered the primary participant and will own the certificate of compliance. While all products will be listed on the Non-GMO Project website under the specific brands, and a licensing agreement must be in place with NGP for each unique brand not owned by the participant. Once the operation type is identified, you will receive a quote and contract to work with NSF. The contract is the terms of engagement between NSF and the operation seeking compliance. This contains traditional business contract information regarding non-disclosures, agreements, and liability. It is important to note that the contract with NSF is limited to the verification service. The Non-GMO Project will independently send a licensing agreement for the use of the Non-GMO Project label. As mentioned, labels must follow the guidelines as listed in that licensing agreement. Next, you would receive the application packet. And so let's start with the compliance plan. We've mentioned that a lot so far. We like to think of the compliance plan as a living document you will maintain to guide and organize how you will comply with the Non-GMO Project program. Any production or handling operations seeking verification to sell, label, or otherwise represent goods with any Non-GMO Project verified claim must fill out the Non-GMO Project compliance plan. This document will vary slightly depending on if you're applying as a brand owner or a handler. For co-packers, this information will be assessed on the co-packer addendum, which must be supplied by each contracted co-packer. The next document is a Non-GMO Project formula sheet. For each multi-ingredient product processed at your operation seeking Non-GMO Project verification, you must complete one Non-GMO Project formula sheet. If your products are single ingredient, you will fill out the single ingredient product list. The next document is the Non-GMO Project Input Supplier List. One Non-GMO Project Input Supplier List listing all suppliers and manufacturers of the inputs or ingredients used in products seeking Non-GMO Project verification must be filled out. Other documents that may be requested include a warehouse affidavit if you have a contracted storage facility that is storing inputs or ingredients to be used in a Non-GMO Project product. Other main documents are documents used to demonstrate compliance for each input used in product seeking verifications, and these can include complete ingredient disclosures such as specification sheets or supplier statements listing all 7 ingredients within each input, identity preservation documentation, compliance affidavits, and sampling and testing plans. And we'll go further into detail about each of these documents to determine what is needed to demonstrate compliance for the inputs used in the manufacturing of products seeking verification. So now let's walk through the documentation needed for our test product, Mama Marcy's Primavera Marinara, followed by a detailed look at the compliant inputs. Depending on the type of operation, whether we are a brand owner with a co-packer or handling manufacturer or another scenario, let us pretend we now have the documents in place to demonstrate the quality management system in place at the facility in which these products are seeking verification. So the initial application, the compliance plan, and the flow chart, as well as related SOPs have all been submitted. So let's take a closer look into the documents needed to demonstrate compliance for the products themselves, which would be the next step.
The first document we will take a closer look at is the product formula sheet. This is where you will list your unique product formula for the products seeking verification. The top portion of the document holds key information about the product. When you prepare a formula sheet, please be sure to complete one for each formula. We'll ask you to indicate the production location, which might be your facility or it could be your co-packer's facility. For the section called Formula Name, please be sure to indicate your internal name for the product, such as generic marinara, whereas the next section will ask for consumer-facing names on the product packaging, like Primavera Marinara and the associated brands. We will also need to know each UPC and container type for each product. This allows the Non-GMO project to provide important information to consumers about your product's verification status, helping consumers to find your product in the store. In the bottom portion of this form, you will list all ingredients used in your formulation and the percentages of each ingredient used. Processing aids must not be included in the product composition unless they are present at 0.5% or more of the finished product, excluding water and salt, and or disclosed in the product label or specification sheet. The ingredient calculations are based on weight, excluding water and salt, and must add to 100%. Note that if salt is used in the formula, it is not included in the product calculations, but should be listed as an input in the product. List each ingredient as it is listed on the specification sheets and reflected on the input supplier lists, which we will go over next. Now we will take a look at the input supplier list, another form we require. Please list all inputs used in the product seeking verification using the names of the ingredients exactly as listed on the specification and product formula sheets. The names of the inputs should match on all documents where the ingredients are referenced. If you are seeking verification for multiple products, we still just ask for one master list listing all inputs and suppliers. If you are seeking approval from multiple suppliers for the same input, be sure to list each supplier and input as a separate entry. If you purchase inputs from a vendor or distributor, for traceability purposes, this relationship needs to be noted on the input supplier list. For example, the manufacturer name via the vendor name. We will then need to demonstrate compliance for each input listed on the input supplier list and used in product seeking verification. To do this, we must classify our inputs. Jessica will now help us take a closer look at your ingredients and how to classify them according to the Non-GMO project standard.
All right, so let's start with our non-risk input, which is defined by the Non-GMO project standard as materials that are not derived from biological organisms and are not, therefore, susceptible to genetic modification. This includes salt, lime, and fossil-based products. Examine the complete input disclosure for compound inputs, including all components of the input in question, to confirm the absence of components with GMO risk. A low-risk input is derived from biological organisms that are not on the monitored risk or high-risk categories as stated in the standard. This typically means the product is a species for which genetic modified versions have not been widely commercialized or for which there are no known or suspected instances of contamination. When we talk about single ingredients, it's pretty easy to decipher if a product will qualify as low risk. It can be a little bit more challenging when you are examining a multi-ingredient or processed product. Monitored risk inputs are certain inputs for which GM organisms are in the research and development stages, which have been developed but are not widely commercially available, or for which known GM organism contamination has occurred. So some examples would include table beets, flax, mustard, rice, wheat, Arctic apples, sugarcane, and others. The monitored risk list can be found in Appendix C of the Non-GMO Project Standard. High-risk inputs are defined as inputs for which GM versions are widely commercially available, including crops, derivative, and animal-derived inputs. Again, similar to what we discussed for non-risk and low risk, when we talk about single ingredients, it's pretty easy to decipher if a product would be high risk. But it can be, again, more challenging when you are examining a multi-ingredient or processed product. That's why a specification sheet or similar document must be provided for each compound ingredient to verify if there are any additional high-risk sub-ingredients. If a high-risk sub-ingredients are present, compliance documentation will be needed for those sub-ingredients based on the percent in the finished product seeking verification. Once an input is identified as high or low risk, it is further classified as a major, minor, or micro ingredient. Product formulas must be submitted with all input percentages noted as weight percentages of the product, not counting the weight of salt or added water in the finished product. If an input is present in the formulation at 5% or greater, it is classified as a major input. If less than 5 but 0.5% or greater, then this is a minor input. And if it's less than 0.5%, it's classified as a micro input. If an input is a defining ingredient, that input is considered a major input regardless of the percentage in the formula. So for example, if an ingredient appears in the name of the product like honey cookies, the input honey is considered a defining ingredient. A defining ingredient must be treated as a major ingredient, again, regardless of the percent in the formula. For each low risk and high risk input, it is essential to verify that the ingredient was produced under conditions designed to avoid GMO cross-contamination or commingling with GMO materials. This is called an identity preservation system. IP, or identity preservation, refers to a system of production and handling practices that maintain the integrity and purity of agricultural commodities through the supply chain. There needs to be proper handling and storage of crops and inputs to assure proper protocols and practices are in place for cleanout, traceability, and segregation of inputs to avoid commingling with other high-risk inputs. For each input, you will need to provide documentation that the supplier has a system in place to avoid GM contamination and commingling. Examples of these documents include organic certificates, ISO, BRC, or other third-party food safety audit certificates. If the input is low risk and fresh produce, the supplier may submit a statement confirming that they do not handle any of the high-risk inputs as listed in Appendix B. For high-risk inputs, documentation must be submitted to demonstrate the input is produced under conditions designed to avoid GMOs, such as sampling and testing, or third-party certifications that specifically address GMO content, such as organic or other non-GM IPs. We'll get into this more detail on what specifically is needed based on the classification for major, minor, or micro.
Now that we have classified our ingredients, we will go into detail on what documents are required to demonstrate compliance for each category. For non-risk inputs, we need a complete ingredient disclosure, like a specification sheet. This document must list all sub-ingredients to confirm the input does not contain any high-risk sub-ingredients and confirms the non-risk status. If the ingredient is already non-GMO project verified with a current valid certification and web listing, you will need to submit the non-GMO project certificate of compliance, screenshot of the web listing, and proof of purchase showing the sale of the verified input from the supplier to you. This could be an invoice or a bill of lading. Monitored risk and low risk inputs require the same documentation. For low risk and monitored risk inputs, submit 2 items. The first is the full ingredient composition. This may be a specification sheet, manufacturer affidavit or statement, etc. that discloses all components of the input. This must disclose all sub-ingredients and source materials to determine risk. For example, if the ingredient is sugar, the document must not only indicate 100% sugar, but must include the source of the sugar, such as 100% beet sugar or 100% cane sugar. For fresh produce, you can accept an invoice as long as the product listing on the invoice is clear. Second, we need documentation to verify that the input was produced under conditions designed to avoid cross-contamination with GM materials, such as a third-party food safety audit certificate, or if the supplier does not handle any high-risk inputs at the facility, a statement confirming this may suffice. If an input composition document discloses high-risk sub-ingredients, the input is classified as high risk and compliance must be demonstrated for the high risk components by percentage in the finished product. If the input is determined to be high risk, as defined in the non-GMO project standards, you will need to consider the following. What percentage is the ingredient used in your products? Micro, minor, or major? If the input is a product of a system designed to avoid GMOs, examples include organic certification and other non-GM identity preservation systems. The use of high-risk inputs will require more documentation. Things like asking, does the supplier have a statistically valid sampling plan and test results, will most likely come into play. NSF has a comprehensive decision tree that helps in determining which paperwork is needed for each type of inputted product, and you can request this from us.
So let's get into a little bit more detail about requirements for major high-risk inputs. If a high-risk input is from a crop, you'll need a valid sampling and testing plan that describes the sample size, lot size, where the testing takes place, what type of test is used, testing frequency, and the lab selected for testing, as well as action thresholds for acceptance. Compliant test results from an NGP approved and ISO 17025 accredited laboratory must be submitted for initial verification, and test results for each lot of input used in product seeking verification will be required to be submitted at the annual renewal. You can find a list of approved and accredited labs on the NGP website. When we talk about high-risk derivatives of crops, we are referring to processed products where sufficient intact DNA may not be present to accurately determine the GM content of the source materials. In this case, a sampling and testing plan is required for the high-risk source material. For example, for refined soybean oil, there will not be sufficient intact DNA for finished product testing. The soybeans used to make the soybean oil would need to be tested. For animal products, high-risk feed materials that are greater than 5% of the feed ration must be tested. And from testing forward, documentation must be submitted to confirm the identity preservation of the tested materials through manufacturing. Compliance for inputs less than 5% or minor inputs may be based on affidavits from suppliers with documentation that confirms the high-risk input was produced from a system designed to avoid GMOs. For example, if the input comes from a country where no GMO cultivation is allowed, and the manufacturer also confirms that they do not import GM varieties. If the input is certified organic or certified to another non-GM IP, the current certificate and product summary listing may be submitted for compliance in lieu of the affidavit. For example, if you are using an organic cornmeal at less than 5%, you may submit the current organic certificate and summary listing organic cornmeal in order to demonstrate compliance. For high-risk inputs that are less than 0.5% and classified as micro-inputs, the compliance documentation required for minor inputs may be submitted. In other words, documentation to demonstrate the input was produced in a system designed to avoid GMOs. If this documentation is not available, the input may qualify for the micro-exemption as stated in Section 2D3 of the Non-GMO Project Standard. Micro-inputs that require evaluation are viable microbes, functional enzymes, and products of synthetic biology. All micro-ingredients not listed in this section may be exempt from evaluation provided that any given product does not contain more than 10 exempt micro-ingredients. Effective May 2019, the finished product may only contain up to 0.9% total micro-exemptions per formula. Additionally, after May 2019, any vitamin or nutrient in a finished supplement product must be non-GMO regardless of the amount.
Depending on the risk category for the input, we put together this table to help guide you. You can see from the top row, a specification sheet is required in all cases, whether an input is non-risk, low-risk, or high-risk at any composition amount. A system designed to avoid cross-contamination with GM materials is required for all ingredient types except non-risk ingredients. Next, you can see that a sampling and testing plan and lab results are required only for high-risk inputs in their testable form with intact DNA. This is a handy tool to use when you're preparing to submit your input documentation.
So let's come back to our product, Mama Marcy's, and take a closer look at classifying the inputs. Here's an up close of the formula. We are looking at the percent of each input in the finished product. We have 4 inputs that are major: crushed tomatoes, tomato paste, canola oil, and garlic puree. The next step is to examine the complete ingredient disclosure for each input. As mentioned earlier, it is important to examine the sub-ingredients within each input to use to fully evaluate the input. At first glance, it's obvious we have one major high-risk input, the canola oil. But we must make sure that the other 3 major inputs do not contain any high-risk sub-ingredients. So let's take a closer look at the specification sheets for each. Here's our specification sheet for crushed tomatoes. We check to make sure that the product name matches the product formula sheet and the supplier is properly listed on the input supplier list. We then check the ingredient panel to make sure there are no high-risk sub-ingredients. We can now say this is a major low-risk input. In order to demonstrate compliance for this low-risk input, we will need to verify that procedures and systems are in place to effectively segregate the low-risk input from potential sources of GM contamination. So we'll need something such as the BRC certificate or if the supplier does not handle any high-risk inputs at their facility, we can accept the statement that they do not handle any high-risk inputs as listed in Appendix B. Here's our specification sheet for tomato paste. Again, the supplier matches the input supplier list. We then check the ingredient panel to make sure there are no high-risk sub-ingredients. Here, we see just tomatoes. Again, we will need to verify that procedures and systems are in place to effectively segregate the low-risk input from potential sources of GM contamination. If the input did have a sub-ingredient such as citric acid, we then require additional documentation that discloses the percentage of the citric acid to determine the percent of citric acid in the finished product, and then the required compliance documentation based on that percentage. So let's say documentation demonstrates that the citric acid is 0.1% of the finished product. We would apply the micro exemption as long as the micro limit has not been met. Here's our specification sheet for the garlic puree. Again, the supplier matches the input supplier list, and we then check the ingredient panel to make sure there are no high-risk sub-ingredients. And again, here we are with just garlic. And again, we will verify that the procedures and systems are in place to effectively segregate the low-risk input from potential GM source contamination. Here's our specification sheet for the canola oil. In this case, the document indicates that the ingredient is non-GMO project verified. So we just need the non-GMO project certificate from the supplier and the screenshot of the non-GMO project website, particularly the web listing of the ingredient. And you will also be required to provide a proof of purchase document such as a bill of lading or invoice if the ingredient has already been purchased. If the ingredient was not verified, the supplier would have to provide a sampling and testing plan for the canola seeds, since the refined canola oil does not contain intact DNA. It is also possible to test the crude oil if they can demonstrate there is sufficient intact DNA. The sampling and testing plan would need to disclose where in the supply chain the canola is tested, what is the sample size, lot size, what laboratory the supplier is sending the sample to, what test is being conducted, the appropriate testing parameters, and the rejection level for inputs with resulting GM content. The supplier would also need to demonstrate that segregation and traceability practices are in place to maintain the identity of the product. So back to the formula. We will now focus on those minor inputs. We examine minor inputs just as we do major. On first glance, we can see we have 3 high-risk inputs: zucchini, basil flavor, and xanthan gum. So zucchini flavor is listed as a high-risk crops per Appendix B of the Non-GMO Project standard. We will need to submit documentation that demonstrates that the zucchini is organic, so organic certificate and summary, or other documentation to demonstrate the non-GM status. Basil flavor 19560. So flavors are on the high-risk list in Appendix B, as they often contain high-risk carriers or flavor components that may be derived from synthetic biology. For flavors, we will most often need to get the percent breakdown of the components and source material for each component. We will also need confirmation from the manufacturer that the flavor components are not derived from synthetic biology. Xanthan gum is a microbial product, so we will need to evaluate the microbe as well as the fermentation media used. For example, corn is usually used. Xanthan gum at a minor level can only be approved if the microbe is non-GM and the fermentation media is low risk, or if high risk, the source comes from a system designed to avoid GMOs. If this is not true for the input, you will need to have to identify another supplier or reformulate so that xanthan gum is less than 0.5% and the micro-exemption can then be applied. Next we see mushrooms, which are on the monitored risk list. So we treat this as a low-risk input and collect specification sheets and/or invoice confirming a raw crop and documentation to demonstrate the mushroom supplied has a system designed to avoid GM contamination or does not handle high-risk inputs as listed in Appendix B. In cases where the full input composition is not disclosed on the specification sheet, including source materials and percentages, you may utilize the NSF Input Declaration Form signed by the manufacturer to disclose this information. This form also requests information on microbes, enzymes, and synthetic biology sources and inputs. This is included in your application packet or can be provided to you upon request. This form is to be completed by the manufacturer, and it's typically sufficient to disclose the input composition and may be submitted in conjunction or in lieu of a specification sheet. The last inputs we have citric acid as a micro. We could apply the micro exemption to this input. Or let's say you are sourcing an NGP verified citric acid, then in this case we would need the NGP certificate of compliance and web listing. For sea salt, this is a non-risk input, but again, we need to confirm that there are no high-risk sub-ingredients. So a specification sheet is required to confirm the composition. Finally, we will go double-check our compliance document using this input supplier list. We can fill out under this section under supporting documents for the list of documents we are providing for each input to ensure we have the requirements for each input based on risk and classification levels. All inputs indicated on the formulas are listed here and all manufacturers are listed. One input by one supplier by one line. The naming convention must match across all documentation for ease of traceability during the reviews.
Once all is deemed compliant, the verification decision is made. Once you have achieved verification, you will receive the certificate and summary from NSF, and the Non-GMO project will provide the verification mark for your use on packaging. Remember, you will be working with a certification project manager who will guide you through these documents and what is needed for compliance. The more complete your application package is in the beginning of the process before pre-assessment, the quicker and smoother your verification process will be. Join us for Pronto, where you will get a broader picture of GMOs, the Non-GMO project, tips for success, and how to leverage your Non-GMO label claim.
All right, so now let's get started with the Q&A section. So you may use the chat feature in the lower left side of your screen to submit a question.